Plymouth Harbor, January 1944. Admiral Sir Charles Little stood at his office window watching another convoy enter the Sound. 18 American Liberty ships, their gray hulls riding low with cargo, their decks stacked with crates and vehicles lashed down under tarpaulins. He'd counted 43 such convoys in the past 2 weeks alone. He turned to his logistics officer. "How many total now?" "American vessels currently in our port, sir." The officer consulted his clipboard. 217, as of this morning's count. That's not including the landing craft still under construction or the vessels we expect next week. Little nodded slowly. He'd been coordinating naval operations for 3 decades. He'd seen the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow. He'd watched the evacuation from Dunkirk. He understood naval logistics on a scale most men couldn't imagine. But this was different. The Americans weren't just contributing to an invasion fleet. They were building one from scratch, on British soil, faster than seemed physically possible. The first American vessels had arrived in Britain for Operation Overlord planning in late 1943. Small numbers initially. A few destroyers, some transports, the advance elements of what would become the Western Naval Task Force under Rear Admiral Alan Kirk. British planners had reviewed the numbers, understood the American commitment, approved the allocations. Understanding numbers on paper and watching those numbers materialize in your harbors were entirely different experiences. By February, the trickle had become a flood. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief for Operation Neptune, maintained his headquarters at Southwick House near Portsmouth. A meticulous planner, Ramsay had orchestrated the Dunkirk evacuation and understood complex naval operations better than almost anyone alive. He'd spent months coordinating with his American counterparts, reviewing ship allocations, planning the intricate choreography of the largest amphibious assault in history. The plan called for nearly 7,000 vessels total. The Americans would provide roughly 3,000 of them. 3,000 vessels. Ramsay had written the number countless times in reports and planning documents, had discussed it in meetings with Eisenhower and Montgomery, had coordinated with Admiral Kirk on their deployment and organization. But watching them actually arrive, day after day, week after week, created a different kind of comprehension. In early March, Ramsay stood on the deck of HMS Largs, his headquarters ship, as an American convoy entered the Solent. He counted the vessels through his binoculars. 22 LSTs, landing ship tank, each capable of carrying 20 Sherman tanks or 33 trucks. Their flat bottoms and bow ramps made them ungainly in rough water, but they could beach themselves, discharge their cargo directly onto sand, then retract and return for more. Behind the LSTs came a line of smaller landing craft, LCILs, landing craft infantry large, each designed to carry 200 troops directly to the beach. Ramsay counted 34 of them in this convoy alone. His flag lieutenant approached. "Sir, the convoy manifest shows 41 more LSTs scheduled to arrive at Plymouth tomorrow, and another convoy of 67 LCIS the day after." Ramsay lowered his binoculars. "Where are they putting them all?" "Plymouth's reporting they're anchoring them in lines extending 3 miles into the Sound, sir. Falmouth has them packed so tight, the harbor master says you could walk from ship to ship across the entire harbor." This wasn't exaggeration. British port commanders were sending increasingly desperate reports about space. The southern coast of England had become one vast naval parking lot, with American vessels filling every available anchorage, every harbor, every inlet deep enough to float a hull. The Americans were also bringing their own port facilities. In April, British engineers watched with professional fascination as U.S. Navy Seabees, construction battalions, assembled floating piers at Portland. These weren't improvised docks. They were engineered structures, prefabricated in America, shipped in sections, and assembled with an industrial efficiency that left the British engineers shaking their heads. Commander Edward Garretts, a British liaison officer working with the American forces, wrote in his diary, "The Yanks have arrived with enough concrete and steel to build a small city. They're not adapting to our ports. They're building their own." The scale became impossible to ignore by late April. British civilians living along the southern coast found their familiar landscapes transformed. Harbors they'd known their entire lives, where they could count the vessels and name half the captains, had become forests of masts and superstructures. The sea itself seemed to have disappeared beneath hulls. A fisherman from Weymouth, forbidden from taking his boat out due to military restrictions, stood on the harbor wall and counted American vessels until he reached 300 and gave up. "I've fished these waters 40 years, he told a reporter. Never seen anything like it. The water's gone. Just ships now, far as you can see." The American contribution wasn't just numbers. It was the types of vessels that revealed the depth of American industrial planning. Admiral Sir Philip Vian, commanding the Eastern Task Force, toured the American anchorages in early May. His British forces would assault Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, while the Americans took Utah and Omaha. He needed to understand what capabilities his American counterparts were bringing. At Plymouth, he boarded the USS Nevada, a battleship that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, raised, repaired, and sailed across the Pacific, through the Panama Canal, and across the Atlantic to support the invasion. Her 14-inch guns could throw a shell weighing 1,400 pounds more than 20 miles inland. "She's one of 3 battleships we're bringing," the American liaison officer explained. "Texas and Arkansas are at Portland. Plus, we've got 3 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, and 34 destroyers assigned to the Western Task Force alone." Vian did the mental arithmetic. The Americans were bringing more heavy naval gunfire support to their 2 beaches than the entire Royal Navy had available for the 3 British beaches. And the Americans were also providing significant support to the British sectors. But the battleships and cruisers, impressive as they were, weren't what made the invasion possible. The landing craft were. By late May, the final counts were becoming clear. The Americans had delivered more than 2,000 landing craft of various types: LSTs, LCIs, LCTs, landing craft tank. Each category with subcategories, each designed for specific purposes. The LST-2s could carry 60 troops and 9 Sherman tanks, or 150 tons of cargo. They could cross the Atlantic under their own power, then beach themselves on D-Day, discharge their load, retract, and return to England for more. The Americans had built over 1,000 of them, and hundreds were now packed into British harbours. The LCVPs, the landing craft vehicle personnel, the small Higgins boats that would actually carry troops to the beaches, numbered in the thousands. Each could carry 36 men or a jeep with crew. They hung from davits on larger ships, ready to be lowered into the water and loaded when the time came. British officers who'd fought in the Mediterranean and seen previous amphibious operations understood what this meant. At Sicily, at Salerno, landing craft shortages had constrained operations, forced compromises, limited what was possible. For Overlord, there would be no shortage. Captain John Hughes Hallett, a British naval officer who'd been involved in planning since the early days, stood on a hill overlooking Weymouth Bay in late May. The harbour below held more than 400 vessels. Beyond them, anchored in rows extending to the horizon, hundreds more waited. "We kept asking for landing craft," he said to a colleague. Every planning session, every meeting, the question was always, do we have enough landing craft? The Americans just kept building them. His colleague, who'd been part of the Dieppe raid planning 2 years earlier, nodded slowly. At Dieppe, they'd scraped together enough landing craft for 5,000 men. Most had been destroyed or damaged. The raid had been a catastrophe. Now, looking at the fleet below, they were planning to land 156,000 men on the first day alone. The scale of American production was one thing. The speed was another. British industry had been on a war footing since 1939. 5 years of rationing, conscription, bombing, and total mobilization. British shipyards were building vessels as fast as possible, but they were also repairing battle damage, maintaining existing fleets, and dealing with material shortages. American industry had ramped up in half the time and was outproducing Britain by factors that seemed impossible. A British Admiralty logistics officer, reviewing production figures, found numbers that made him recalculate 3 times to ensure he hadn't made an error. In 1943 alone, American shipyards had launched more than 2,000 landing craft of various types. In a single year, they'd built more specialized amphibious vessels than Britain had built in the entire war. The Liberty ships, the standard American cargo vessels, were being completed at a rate of 3 per day across all American shipyards. 3 ships per day. Some yards were launching a completed vessel every 4 days from a single slipway. "They're not building ships," one British officer observed. "They're manufacturing them." The difference was more than semantic. American shipyards had adopted assembly line techniques, prefabrication, and mass production methods that British yards, with their traditional craftsmanship approaches, couldn't match. The result was visible in every British port by late May 1944. Admiral Ramsay held his final planning conference on May 28th. More than 100 senior officers crowded into the room at Southwick House. British, American, Canadian, and Free French naval commanders reviewed the final dispositions. Ramsay stood before a massive map showing the English Channel and the Normandy coast. Colored pins marked the positions of task forces, bombardment groups, transport areas, and minesweeper lanes. "Gentlemen, the final count," Ramsay said. 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary vessels, 864 merchant ships. He paused, letting the numbers settle. Of these, the American contribution is approximately 3,000 vessels, including the majority of our LSTs and a substantial portion of our fire support ships. The room was silent. Every officer present understood naval logistics. They'd spent careers managing fleets, coordinating operations, calculating tonnages and capacities. They knew these numbers represented not just ships, but the industrial capacity of an entire nation bent toward a single purpose. Admiral Sir Harold Burrough, who would command one of the British task forces, spoke up. "The last time England assembled a fleet this size was for the Armada, and that was to defend against invasion, not launch one." Ramsay nodded. "The last time anyone assembled a fleet this size was never. This is the largest naval operation in history, and it's only possible because of American productive capacity. In the days before D-Day, British officers made final tours of their sectors. What they saw defied comprehension, even for men who'd spent their lives at sea. From Portland Bill, looking west, the sea was solid with ships. From Portsmouth, looking east, the same. The Solent had become a steel channel, with vessels anchored so close their hulls nearly touched. Every harbor, every anchorage, every protected water on the southern coast held ships, and still they kept arriving. On June 3rd, with the invasion just days away, a convoy of 47 American LSTs entered Plymouth Sound. The harbor master, who'd been awake for 36 hours straight coordinating anchorages, stared at his chart. There was no more room. The harbor was full. The Sound was full. Every anchorage was packed to capacity. He ordered them to anchor in a line extending out to sea, bow to stern, creating a floating pier of vessels stretching nearly 2 miles. The Americans complied without complaint. They had been doing this for months, parking their ships wherever space could be found, waiting for the order to load troops and head south. British troops, boarding their assigned vessels in early June, found themselves walking past American ships for hundreds of yards before reaching their own transports. The Americans lined the rails, watching the British embark, offering cigarettes, wisecracks, and quiet encouragement. A British sergeant, leading his platoon up the gangway of a converted merchant ship, looked back at the harbor. Ships in every direction. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them. A fleet that seemed to stretch to the horizon and beyond. "Bloody hell," he muttered to his corporal. "The Yanks really did bring everyone." The corporal, who'd fought in North Africa and Italy, who'd seen American forces arrive in those theaters, nodded. "They always do, Sarge. They always do." On June 4th, Eisenhower postponed the invasion 24 hours due to weather. 6,939 vessels, many already loaded with troops, waited. British port commanders, already stretched beyond capacity, now faced the challenge of keeping this massive fleet organized and supplied for an additional day. Fuel, food, water, medical supplies, ammunition, all had to be distributed to thousands of vessels scattered across dozens of harbors.